Jared Dillian Show.
I'm Jared Dillian. This is the Jared Dillian Show. If you want to call to talk about your money, please call 844-305-7800. That's 844-305-7800. This is the Jared Dillian Show. You might have seen that GDP was down 32% today. That's kind of a misleading figure. But by the way, that's for the second quarter. Okay. Economic activity did not contract 32% in one quarter. That's not what happened. It contracted like 8%, and basically the 32% is an annualized number. So it wasn't a 32% crash in GDP. That's annualized. So it's going to go back up next quarter. We're still going to be in recession. It's still like a very severe recession, and things are bad, but they're not 32% bad. And plus, this was better than expected. The number, the consensus number was 34%. So this was actually better than expected. Now, this is backwards looking information. Okay. This doesn't tell you about what's going to happen in the future. This only tells you about what happened in the past. Okay. Which means, from an economic forecasting standpoint, GDP statistics are completely useless. Basically, what they are is a report card. They tell you about how the economy did, not how the economy is going to do. Useless from a forecasting perspective. We already know that the economy tanked in the second quarter. That was when the virus hit. It's going to be better later this year. So let's talk about GDP. GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product. Gross Domestic Product. And GDP measures economic output. It measures economic output. It is the value of all the goods and services produced in the United States in a single year. That's what GDP is. And it's based on a formula. And we're going to do formulas on the radio. We're gonna do a formula on the radio. The formula is G plus C plus I plus NX equals GDP. Let's talk about this for a second. G is government spending. Okay. So whatever the government spends in a given quarter, let's say $1 trillion, that goes into GDP. Consumption is what you and I spend. Okay, what we spend on Amazon, what we spend in the gas station, what we spend in Target. You add it all up, that's consumption. That is the biggest part of GDP. Consumption is about 70% of GDP. And if you look at why GDP dropped, it wasn't government spending that dropped. It was consumption that dropped. And it dropped dramatically. I is investment. That's investment in real estate, investment in stocks and bonds. And NX is net exports. So it's exports minus imports. And that's usually a negative number for us because we import more than we export. So that's usually a negative number in GDP. You add that all up, and that's what you get for GDP, which is output. It's economic output. It's the value of all goods and services produced in the United States in a single year GDP. Okay. There's nothing very exciting about GDP. I mean, if you're going to talk about economic indicators, I like to look at things like consumer confidence. That tells you how people are feeling about the economy. That is useful information. There's a couple of consumer confidence indicators. I like looking at inflation. Inflation is very important. I like looking at retail sales. I like looking at new home sales, building permits, stuff like that. That, to me, is more useful economic information. GDP is backward looking. It only talks about what happened in the past. Now, if you go back and look at GDP growth over time, it used to be higher. If you go back to the 50s, we were growing at like 6, 7, 8% a year. If you go back to the 2000s, the 90s, we were growing at about 4% a year. Now we're growing at about 3% a year. So the growth has slowed down. It's a more mature economy, and there's regulation has something to do with it and all that stuff. So what is this a function of? It's a function of a lot of things. It's a function of people and productivity. So GDP really is how many people are working, how hard they work, how long they work, and how productive they are, right? So we are in a recession. By the way, let me just talk about recessions for a second. The definition of a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP. So we are definitely in a recession right now. That's decided. We're in a recession. 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP. There is no formal definition for a depression. Okay, we've had severe recessions over time. This is a severe recession. We had a severe recession in 1982. We had a pretty severe recession in 1974. What we had in the 30s was a depression, and it lasted for 17 years. We don't want to have one of those ever again, but we are not in a depression right now. But getting back to people and productivity, one of the things I talked about on the show last night was that people are working less and they're working less productively. Okay. The average hours worked in the United States is 33 hours, which is not a lot. And people are, quite frankly, are spending more time unproductively. They're spending time on Facebook. We just talked about Facebook. Facebook is a big time killer. Twitter is a big time killer. It occupies some of my day. It's time that I can't get back. Okay. When the internet first came out, we had massive productivity increases, huge productivity increases, and all the productivity increases are gone. Okay. And people have been working less over the years. And we have more of a demand for leisure time. There's more of a demand for leisure time. People want to work less. And if you go back 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we used to look at Europe and we used to look down on Europe and we used to say, well, they just, they don't work. It's the French. They sit in cafes. They smoke cigarettes. They drink coffee. They're not at work. Greece, they work pretty hard in Germany, but we sort of had like all these, stereotypes of cultures in Europe not working very much. We are becoming that. We are becoming that. Go back 20 years ago, when the economy was hot, back in the internet bubble, and people were working 2 jobs, people were working 3 jobs, people were working 16 hours a day. That culture has sort of disappeared. Now there is more of a demand for leisure time. And these are philosophical issues, but this contributes, I think, to our lower growth rate. People simply aren't working as hard. Let's talk about manufacturing for a second. Decades ago, our economy was based on manufacturing. The United States produced things. We are not really a manufacturing economy anymore. We are a service economy today. And just, for sake of example, the restaurant industry has gotten really big. And yes, there are some restaurants that are closing right now, but the restaurant industry got really big, and you had a lot of people that were in manufacturing jobs, and those jobs disappeared, and they moved into service jobs. I don't know what the exact numbers are, but I want to say that service jobs account for about 80% of the economy. A lot of manufacturing jobs were lost to overseas where labor cost was lower. If you own a company and you produce something, whether it's, say, dog beds, okay, you produce dog beds. It's expensive to produce dog beds in the United States. You have to pay the workers more. You have to pay benefits. You have to pay payroll taxes. You have to pay insurance, all this stuff. And it just dramatically increases the cost of producing things. It's cheaper to produce something overseas and where you have much lower labor costs. And then just even with the shipping back to the United States, it's much, much cheaper. So this is what happened in the 2000s. This is what happened in the 2000s with China. And a lot of those manufacturing jobs were lost, and people had to move into service jobs. U.S. corporations will always seek to minimize their costs. Tim Cook was in front of Congress the other day, and he was getting some questions about China in the congressional hearings the other day, because Apple manufactures everything in China. All the manufacturing is in China. None of it is in the United States. It's all in China. Apple is a design company. It's not a computer company. It's not a manufacturing company. It's a design company. Apple has like 80,000 employees. All of these products are manufactured in China at a company called Foxconn, and Foxconn has over 1 million employees, and that's where all the manufacturing is done for your iPhone. So if I were Tim Cook, if I were sitting in these congressional hearings and, they were giving me crap about manufacturing in China, and be like, okay, we can manufacture in the United States. Now your iPhone is going to cost $5,000. Like, that's the answer. So if we brought all these jobs back home and they were union jobs, your iPhone would cost $5,000. Having said that, Apple has pretty impressive profit margins of about 30%, which they have maintained over time. If companies start bringing their manufacturing back to the U.S., costs are going to go up a lot. This is where the inflation comes in. I mean, the inflation comes, from the Federal Reserve, and it comes from deficit spending. But also, if we experience deglobalization, where trade is minimized, and we start bringing manufacturing jobs back home, then stuff is going to be more expensive. I had this moment in Walmart years ago as I was looking for a doormat for our house. I was in Walmart, and they had a pile of these rubber doormats, and they were $4 a piece. And if you think about the economics of that, the raw materials that go into the doormat, the manufacturing, the value added, shipping it back to the U.S., and Walmart is able to sell a $4 doormat at about a 3% profit. I'm Jared Dillian. This is The Jared Dillian Show.
Jared Dillian Show.